and welcome back to the Literary Layer. Thank you so much for joining. So today we're going to be talking about The Warmth of Other Suns, and this is by Isabel Wilkerson, and this talks about the Great Migration. Wow. There's so much information to unpack within this book that I literally can't do it justice within the few minutes that I'm going to talk about it. It would take me hours to dissect this and do this book justice. But I'm going to give a brief summary because I feel this is an important book for people to understand America's history and understand things that affect us currently today. And this is not often talked about, and it affects so many of us today. All right, so for those of you that are not familiar with the Great Migration, it's where Southern blacks moved to different parts of America. And the Great Migration, it lasted around 60 years from 1910 to 1970. And it's estimated that around 6 million blacks left the South during this time frame. The Great Migration was the final break from an abusive union with the South. It was a step in freeing not just the people who fled, but the country whose mountains they crossed. It was, if nothing else, an affirmation of the power of an individual decision, however powerless the individual might appear on the surface. So why did Isabel Wilkerson want to write this book? There were many reasons that she wanted to write this book. She wanted to really set the record straight. So it had been said by many people that the Great Migration was a jobs-driven effort and driven by World War I, despite evidence that showed otherwise. There were several decades of evidence that showed that it was not just related to jobs, it was not just related to World War I. Also, many blacks during this time of the Great Migration moved to different cities throughout America, but what was mainly discussed was the movement from Mississippi to Chicago, and that was because of the large volume of blacks that were in Chicago that moved from Mississippi. And there were also social scientists in Chicago that brought a lot of attention to this movement, and they wanted to study it further. So of course, if they're in Chicago, they're going to mainly talk about Chicago. But she wanted to make sure that everyone knew that she wanted to get the message out that it was not just Chicago from Mississippi, that this was larger than people could even imagine, that there were many more cities that blacks were moving to and migrating from. And I'm just really touching on the main points throughout this book. There's so much more that I won't be able to get to, so I suggest that you go ahead and purchase the book and just take some time. It's going to take a while to get through it. It took me probably about 4 weeks to get through it because I kept starting and stopping and taking notes. I just wanted to soak in all this information, and also it was very heavy, so I had to take breaks from it. So when Isabel was writing this book, she interviewed more than 1,000 people, and because she wanted to get the firsthand account of what happened during the Great Migration, what was their reason for moving, what were some of the things they experienced in the South, what were some of the things they experienced when they moved to the North. So this book mainly focuses on 3 individuals. Those are Ida Mae Brandon Gladney from Mississippi, George Swanson Starling from Florida, and Robert Joseph Pershing Foster from Louisiana. There's also many other people that were discussed throughout the book, but those were the main 3 people that she interviewed who mainly told their full life stories. Why were so many Southerners wanting to leave the South and head to other parts of the country? They found that the treatment they received after slavery was not much better than what they received during slavery. They often worked as sharecroppers. They were kind of doing the same things that they were doing during slavery, but they would be paid for it. And although it sounds good, they were often paid very little, which was not enough to really live on and support themselves. And also at the end of the planting season, the planter or the landowner would often say that the sharecroppers owed them money. They would be in debt to them. So they would just continue this endless cycle of working, continuing to work, continuing to be in debt to the planter, and never being able to break out of this cycle and not really having enough money to do anything on their own. So they often lived on the planter's land, similar to slavery. And it just kept them in a never-ending cycle of poverty. Also during this time period, there were blacks that were hauled off to remote plantations or turpentine camps. They were held by force, beaten, or shot if they tried to escape. And this was an illegal form of slavery called debt peonage. And I had never heard of that before until I read this book. So debt peonage, that existed in Florida, Georgia, Alabama, and other parts of the Deep South well into the 1940s. Federal investigations into neo-slavery in Florida uncovered numerous abuses of kidnapping and enslavement and led to a 1942 indictment and trial of a sugar plantation company in the Everglades. So, even though they were out, even though slavery had ended, they still were not receiving fair treatment, were not being treated as equals, but were still being basically taken advantage of. Also, during this time frame, Black people had to put on a show and appeared to be cheerful and inferior to whites, or they would face severe consequences. That included torture, jail, and sometimes it led up to murder. I know that we've all heard of the public hangings that were common during that time frame. So if a white person were walking on the sidewalk toward a Black person, the Black person had to get off of the sidewalk and let them pass. They also could not look in the direction of a white woman. They were treated as less than. Like a Black person, they could not question a white person, especially not in public. If they did, they would face severe consequences. It didn't matter if what they were saying was right. Like if maybe they were going to the store and they were owed a certain amount back. It didn't matter what they said. The store owner could give them a penny back and they were owed 5 cents. It wouldn't matter what they said. They were to not question it. They were just to accept that what the white store owner said was correct. The white person had the final say so in all matters. Each generation had to learn the rules without understanding why, because there was no understanding why, and each one either accepted or rebelled in that moment of realization and paid a price, whichever they chose. I think this is also part of why Black people still to this day continue to code switch, because it was something that was learned during this time frame, during slavery and after. During the Great Migration, it was learned as a form of protection. So I believe that's why that still continues today. During World War I, Northerners began secretly recruiting Black people to come to the North. They were having an issue with labor. There was a labor crisis during the time, and they wanted to recruit Black Southerners to come up north to work. They knew that these people were hard workers, and they knew that that was the easiest way to find workers in bulk. When the South found out about this, they went to great lengths to try to prevent the Blacks from leaving. If all the South's workers who are doing this free and cheap labor are leaving, then what is the South going to do now? They aren't used to working. They're used to having the Black Southerners work for them for a low rate or for nothing at all. So of course they wanted to prevent this, because they didn't want to lose their wealth. They didn't want to lose their earnings from their crops. Southerners were migrating to different parts of the United States, and where they ended up, that was often based on the rail line. So it would depend on where the rail line would connect. So many Blacks in the coastal states of Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia ended up in Washington, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, while many Blacks from Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, and Arkansas ended up in Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, Milwaukee, and Pittsburgh. Also, there were many Blacks from Louisiana and Texas that ended up being on the West Coast. So if you live in those states now, you probably find it pretty common for your family to say, hey, we have some cousins down in this particular area. And, when you hear that, just think that's based on where the rail line was. There was a direct connection from this city going up to those areas in the north and on the West Coast. So that's how they ended up in those areas most of the time. They traveled on trains most of the time when they were migrating, and they had to sit in the Jim Crow cars, which were Black only rail cars that were used to carry the luggage. Sometimes there was even funeral homes that would sneak people in, like when they were trying to escape the South without being caught. Sometimes funeral homes would collaborate with people from the North, and they would sneak people in coffins up to the north. And to this day, they still have many secrets about how many people actually made it from the south to the north or the west coast in a coffin. After fleeing the south, many blacks soon realized that some of these cities weren't the safe haven that they thought they were. People often use the term James Crow in these cities instead of Jim Crow. The treatment is pretty much still the same as Jim Crow, so that's why they were calling it James Crow. They still were not being treated as equals. And Robert Pershing Foster, he experienced this firsthand when he traveled over 1,000 miles from Louisiana to California, and he needed to stop. So he was told, he really thought that once he got closer to California out of El Paso, that he was going to be able to secure a hotel room for the night since he had driven so far. But, he's tried to stop in Arizona. They wouldn't give him a room, and he experienced this several times throughout his drive from Arizona throughout California, even though he thought it was safer. Many people would not give him a room for the night because he was black. They would say things like they didn't have any rooms for the night, or they would just outright tell him that they didn't rent out rooms to blacks. Now, millions actually ended up migrating from the south, but the actual number is believed to be an estimate. That's really an underestimate, because some migrants who could pass as white ended up passing as white and then, melting into white society, and they would never be heard from again. So, of course, they wouldn't answer to the census and saying that they were a black person, or they wouldn't keep in touch with any of their black relatives who could possibly, tell on them and out them out and blow their cover. Also, there were many black men that feared being sent home, so they didn't respond to the census. They were afraid that maybe the planters from back home would say that they still owed them money from when they were sharecropping, like to say that they were still in debt, or maybe just for some other reason they would be sent back to the south. So they didn't want to take that chance, and they didn't respond to the census. So that's why it's believed that the actual numbers from how many people actually moved during the Great Migration is underestimated. As the years went on, blacks are still moving from the south to these different areas within America. Not only did the blacks from the south have to deal with unequal treatment from whites, they also began having to deal with being stereotyped by black northerners as well, who saw them as being inferior. Now, even though the migrants were often just as educated or had even more education than the blacks or the whites in these cities that they were moving to, now by the 1950s, migrants would arrive with higher education than earlier waves of migrants, and they had a greater employment potential than both the blacks they left behind as well as the blacks that they joined. They were also more likely to be married and remain married. They were less likely to have children outside of wedlock, and they were less likely to have single parent households, and they were more likely to be employed because of their willingness to work longer hours or more than one job, because they were already used to doing this in the South. Throughout this book, there were really a lot of sad and oftentimes brutal moments that were difficult to read, but it's important part of history that may not feel good. It's just good to always know what happened so that we can make sure it doesn't happen in the future. It was normal for northerners to send their children to the South to spend time with their family, just to make sure that they still had that connection and didn't forget about them. They felt that many of them felt that was still important to do. Now, the northerners, they taught their children the do's and don'ts in the South. Sadly, Emmett Till was one of the people that was sent down south by his mother to visit his great uncle in Mississippi. Emmett Till was her only son. He was falsely accused of offending a white woman and was later found dead in the Tallahatchie River. His mother wanted her only son to have an open casket so that everyone could see how brutal her son's murder was and to see what people were doing to blacks down in the South. And there were thousands that lined up to see his body, including Ida Mae, which is one of the people that was interviewed during this book. So there are several stories that were very sad and very brutal throughout this book, and it just makes you just wonder why someone would treat another human being this way. So that's a trigger warning for anyone that reads this. There is a lot of talk of murder and torture throughout this book. In the simple process of walking away one by one, wrote the scholar Lawrence R. Rogers, millions of African American Southerners have altered the course of their own and all of America's history. In closing, I hope that after hearing more about the Great Migration, reading about it, taking time to really dissect the material, I hope that a lot of Black people will hear these stories and understand exactly what our ancestors had to go through to make sure we have some of the things that we have today, some of the opportunities that we have today. We don't have to continue living in poverty. We don't have to continue living in welfare. We don't have to continue with these high crime rates in these cities when we're just trying to have a better life. We don't have to submit to being inferior to others. We do have a lot of opportunities, and I hope that seeing how much and hearing about how much the people that came before us actually sacrificed, the brutal moments that they had to go through, the torture, the death, the just outright just being treated worse than animals. I hope that we can, see that we do have a lot of opportunity, and we can do things that the people that came before us could not even dream of. So just take advantage of those opportunities. Try to do things that will make yourself better each day. And just try not to beat yourself down or fall into the stereotypes that sometimes maybe other people might want you to fall into. I hope that the non-Blacks will continue the work that allies that came before them actually started. Just learn from the history, spread the message, and ensure that these type of tragedies never happen again. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.